In the previous video, we discussed the required hardware for a Kali Linux installation. Let's proceed with the installation. For that, we will use a virtualization platform called VirtualBox. As I mentioned, we will use a virtual environment throughout this course in order to run Kali Linux. This approach has a few advantages over running a dedicated Kali Linux machine. The main advantage is that you could still run your favorite operating system, being Windows 10 in my case, but it also can be Mac OS X or Linux for instance, while being able to get familiar or experiment with Kali Linux. This is a great way to try Kali Linux, especially for someone who never tried it before. It allows you to get familiar with its interface and tools, and if you later decide that you enjoy working with Kali Linux, you can install it on a separate machine or even as a dual boot option along with your current operating system. But for the most cases, a virtual machine will suffice. The software that we are going to use in order to run Kali Linux in a virtual environment is VirtualBox. Developed by the Oracle Corporation, VirtualBox is a cross-platform virtualization application. But what does that mean? For one thing, it installs on your existing Intel or AMD-based computers, whether they are running Windows, Mac, Linux, or Solaris operating systems. Secondly, it extends the capabilities of your existing computer so that it can run multiple operating systems that run inside multiple virtual machines at the same time. For example, you can run Windows and Linux on your Mac all alongside your existing applications. You can install and run as many virtual machines as you like. The only practical limits are disk space and your computer's memory. As the disk space does not represent a problem with modern computers, the more memory you have on your system, the more concomitant virtual machines you will be able to run. But without further ado, let's get started with VirtualBox installation. By using the browser of your choice, navigate to virtualbox.org. From here, you will be able to download the latest version of VirtualBox. Just make sure that you are downloading the one that corresponds to your operating system. This is a fairly small download compared to the Kali Linux image download, which we'll look into right now. So open a new tab on your browser, or you can even use the existing one, and navigate to offensive-security.com. The Offensive Security website offers pre-generated Kali Linux images for virtual platforms like VirtualBox. This will represent another advantage when using VirtualBox because we will not need to perform an installation of the Kali Linux system. The VirtualBox image contains a ready-to-run instance of Kali. We just need to apply a few settings and we will have the Kali Linux up and running in no time. As we can see, there are several platforms used for virtualization, not only VirtualBox. There is VMware, which is something similar to VirtualBox, and then there is Hyper-V. As we are interested in the Kali Linux image for VirtualBox, click on the corresponding tab, and here we get to choose the type of the Kali Linux image that we want to use. There are both 64 and 32-bit images available for the full and light version of Kali Linux. As you can imagine, the light version does not contain all the tools that can be found in the full version, thus the difference in the file size. But what about the 64 and 32-bit versions? Which one should you choose? I'll pick the 64-bit one in my case, and I'll explain soon why is that. So, what about the 64 versus 32-bit versions? Well, these days, most of the modern computers are running a 64-bit operating system. But if you have an older computer, you might still be running a 32-bit operating system. So how can you tell? It's easy to identify. If you're running Windows 10, right-click on the Start button and choose System from the menu that appears. If you're running an older version of Windows, you can find a shortcut for your system properties in your control panel. As we can see, I'm running a 64-bit operating system, but yours might be a 32-bit one, especially if you own an older computer. Same goes for the macOS X. While the latest versions of macOS X are 64 bits only, if you're running a version that is older than macOS X version number 10.6, your operating system might be a 32-bit one. If you can't determine the type of your operating system as being 64 or 32-bit one, the safest assumption to make will be that you are running a 32-bit system. This way, you will avoid the problems raised by trying to run a 64-bit image on a 32-bit operating system. Now that both downloads have finished, let's start by first installing VirtualBox. This is a straightforward install process. Open the application and click the Run button. On the first screen, click Next. On the Custom Setup screen, you can choose some of the features that you want or don't want to be installed. You can also change the install path that will be used by the application. I use the default options here and will click Next. Same goes for the next screen that allows you to create a Start menu entry, a desktop icon, a quick launch bar shortcut, and to register file associations. We'll click Next and a warning is displayed letting us know that during installation our network configuration will be reset, so make sure that you are not downloading anything else. Confirm this by clicking Yes and finally Install. As soon as the installation is finished, we get the option to start the VirtualBox application immediately. Please note that depending on some situations, you might be asked to reboot your system after the installation. Please proceed and reboot the system in case you are asked to do so. Otherwise, press the Finish button, which will complete the installation process and will launch the application. Now that the VirtualBox is up and running, it's time to import the Kali Linux image, also known as a VirtualBox appliance. For that, we will need to browse to our Downloads folder and depending on the fact that you registered the file associations during the VirtualBox installation or not, you will see this orange icon with the text OVA. OVA stands for Open Virtualization Archive and contains a compressed, installable version of a virtual image. Now, because I also have VMware installed on this computer, I will right-click on this icon and will select Open With. From the menu that appears, I will select VirtualBox Manager. Give it a few moments and a new VirtualBox instance will be launched and a new window called Import Virtual Appliance will be displayed. Here you can modify any of the settings that will be used to run your newly imported image. I usually leave this as they are, but one of the settings that you might want to change is the amount of RAM or memory allocated to this machine. Depending on the memory available on your machine, you can choose to increase or decrease the amount of allocated memory here. Usually, a 2 GB memory allocation should be more than enough for a Kali Linux instance. Another setting that I usually change before starting the Kali Linux machine has to do with the network interface, but for now, let's press Import and the process of importing the image in VirtualBox will start. This will take a few minutes, so I will fast forward the video here. Now that the import is complete, let's take a look at the network interface settings that I mentioned earlier. For that, we will need to select the Kali Linux appliance and then click Settings. Select the Network tab, and as we can see, the default type of network connection is set to NAT or Network Address Translation. But I want my Kali Linux machine to be able to access the internet and also be part of my local network, so I can access it later through SSH if needed. For that, we will need to change the connection type to bridged adapter. This way, the Kali machine will receive an IP address allocated by my router and will also get access to the internet. Next, you need to make sure that the network adapter that is used to connect your machine to the internet is selected. Usually this is automatically detected, but in case it is not, you can select it from this list. Finally, we click OK, and we are now able to run the Kali Linux machine for the first time. In order to do that, we press the Start button. Next, we can see the boot screen of the Kali Linux. If we press Enter or click on the default selection, which is to load Kali Linux, the boot process should start. Now, if it happens to click inside the Kali Linux window, you will see this message telling you that the mouse cursor has been captured by the virtual machine and you can use the so-called host key, which on the Windows is right control, to release it. So the thing that you need to remember here is that the host key of the application is the right control key. The key will be used to pause the machine or reset it, maximize the window, minimize it, and so on. As soon as the virtual machine has finished loading, we can see the login screen. This will ask us for a username and a password. Now, where can we find this information? Well, if you ever used Kali Linux previously or used another Linux distribution, you might know that all these machines come with a default administrative account called root. The same applies to Kali Linux. But where can we find the password for the root account? Switching back to the Offensive Securities website, right before the links to the Kali Linux download, we can see a red line of text telling us that these images have a default password of Tor, which is root spelled backwards. So the username is root and the password is Tor. In case you forget this later, you can always perform a Google search for this information. Back to our Kali Linux virtual machine, I will use root as the username and Tor as password. And voila! We've been able to log in successfully and gained access to the Kali Linux graphical interface. From here, we can access all these great tools that we will use in the upcoming videos. To conclude, in this video, we downloaded and installed the VirtualBox application that will allow us to create a virtual environment on top of our operating system. VirtualBox is available for Windows, Mac OS X, Linux and Solaris. Next, we downloaded the Kali Linux image for VirtualBox from the Offensive Securities website, and by importing it into VirtualBox, we were able to run Kali Linux in a virtual environment on our machine. In the next video, we will install Kali Linux on a Raspberry Pi, a device that is small but powerful, a great candidate for a pen testing machine running Kali Linux.